The sun, a molten, forged disk, mercilessly baked the earth, relentlessly burning away the remnants of the morning dew. Dry, fine dust rose with every gust of wind, shrouding everything in a gray, suffocating veil. Somewhere on the horizon, in the shimmering haze, danced the ghostly silhouettes of mountains, but here, in the scorched valley, time seemed to stand still, subservient only to the rhythm of arduous labor and the oppressive silence of the desert. Jacob, a farmer with a face etched by the sun and eyes the color of faded steel, slowly walked across his field, carefully inspecting the wheat stalks. Each year, this land offered him a meager harvest, demanding in return immense effort and unyielding patience. He had long grown accustomed to solitude. His wife had died 3 years ago, leaving him only bitter memories of warm hands and quiet laughter, which now echoed only in his mind. He had no neighbors, only endless kilometers of scorched earth separated him from the nearest settlement. On that day, as the sun was already sinking towards the horizon, casting longer and longer shadows, Jacob suddenly heard a strange, alien noise. At first, it seemed to him that it was just the howling of the wind, but the sound grew more persistent, more intrusive, as though someone was desperately trying to break through the storm. He moved towards the sound, not forgetting to grab the old revolver hanging on his belt. Reaching the field's edge, where thickets of bushes closed into an impenetrable wall, he saw her. The woman lay on the ground, writhing in agonizing pain. Her clothes were torn, and blood slowly seeped from under her shirt sleeve, staining the earth crimson. Her eyes, like two dark lakes, were wide open, a chilling fear frozen within them. Jacob, despite his harsh nature, couldn't pass by. He wasn't one to leave the wounded to their fate. Carefully lifting the woman, he carried her to his home, placing her on an old, well-worn couch. The wound proved deep, the bullet had gone right through. He washed the wound with cold water and bandaged it, using cloth from his only clean shirt. All this time, the woman remained silent, only occasionally groaning in pain, as if waves were crashing and receding. After several days, when the fever seemed to be subsiding, she finally spoke. Her voice, broken by the rasp of long silence, sounded soft, like the whisper of leaves. She introduced herself as Elizabeth. Without a word about what had happened to her, she only asked to be allowed to leave as soon as she could stand on her feet. Jacob nodded, but in his heart, he knew that it wouldn't end so easily. Elizabeth was recovering quickly, although weakness still hampered her movements. She helped Jacob with the chores, and it seemed that her skillful hands could handle any task. Gradually, in their silent communication, something more than just mutual respect began to emerge. Jacob, accustomed to solitude, felt something warm begin to blossom in his heart, something he thought he had long ago buried deep within his soul. Elizabeth seemed to have found a long-awaited refuge in him, peace and protection. But one morning, when the first rays of the sun painted the sky crimson, strangers arrived in the valley, like harbingers of misfortune. 3 men, in wide-brimmed hats, with weapons ready to fire, looked sinister, as if they had stepped out of the pages of dark legends. They rode past Jacob's house, ignoring it, and headed straight for the barn. Jacob felt a chilling terror grip him from within. He immediately understood what had brought these people here. After several minutes, the men returned, their faces expressing grim satisfaction. One of them, with a heavy step, approached Jacob. "We are looking for Elizabeth Blackwood," he said roughly. "The West's most wanted criminal. Is she here?" Jacob slowly, with difficulty, moved his head, his gaze darting around the room, trying to find any hint of Elizabeth's presence. He knew he had to lie, even if that lie became the last thing he did in his life. But betraying Elizabeth, giving her up, he simply couldn't. He couldn't do that to the trust she had shown him, to the faith she had placed in him. "I don't know any Elizabeth," he said firmly, trying to make his voice sound confident, despite the shiver that ran through his body. The men standing before him exchanged glances, their faces seeming to darken further. One of them, with a long, ugly scar crossing his entire left cheek, curled his lips into a contemptuous sneer, bearing a row of yellowish teeth. "Don't bother lying, old man," he hissed, his voice full of menace. "We know she's here. And if you don't give her up, you'll bitterly regret it." A long, agonizing pause descended, thick in the air. Jacob saw hunger and cruelty etched in the men's eyes. He knew they wouldn't stop until they got what they wanted. He felt his solitary life, poised on the edge, existing precariously on a knife's edge, about to crumble, to turn to dust. At that very moment, Elizabeth emerged from the house. She was as pale as death, but a resolute fire burned in her eyes, a flame capable of illuminating the deepest darkness. She raised her hands, as if surrendering, yet simultaneously embodying defiance. "I'm here," she whispered, her voice trembling almost imperceptibly. "You found me." The men sneered, their faces contorted with wicked glee. The scarred man, tall and gaunt, stepped forward, his shadow stretching across the ground, an omen of the impending disaster. He produced handcuffs, which glinted in the dim light. "You know what awaits us, Elizabeth," he rasped, his voice sounding like it was made of dry wood. They began to approach her, unaware that Jacob, hidden in the shadows, was gripping his revolver convulsively. At that moment, his doubts, his fears, his hopes, all were compressed into a single, tight, painful knot, constricting his throat. It became clear to him what he had to do. He could not let them take her, he couldn't allow this grim procession to end like this. Without a word, Jacob fired. The first shot, a deafening crack in the silence, brought the scarred man to his knees. The second shot, a desperate cry, felled another bandit, sending him sprawling to the ground. The third bullet hissed like a snake, forcing the third man to his knees, clutching his stomach, his face contorted in a grimace of pain. Jacob stood frozen, gripping the smoking revolver. Sparks of madness danced in his gaze, his eyes devouring everything around him. Elizabeth watched him intently. Astonishment and unspoken gratitude flickered in the depths of her eyes. She realized Jacob had made his choice, and that choice was her. When the smoke finally cleared, Elizabeth cautiously approached him, gently touching his arm. Jacob remained silent, his face seemingly petrified, devoid of any emotion. "Why? She whispered, her voice trembling barely audible. Jacob slowly raised his eyes, meeting hers. "Because I need you," he responded just as quietly. "Because I don't want to be alone." They stood side by side against the backdrop of a lifeless sky, their silence speaking louder than 1,000 words. A long journey lay before them, a path filled with dangers they preferred not to contemplate. But for now, they were together, and that seemed to outweigh all hardship. Jacob understood, from now on, they were fugitives. He would have to leave behind his home, the land where he had grown up, and everything he held dear. But he was ready. He knew danger awaited them, pursuit, hunger, perhaps even death. But he was no longer alone. Elizabeth was not just a criminal, she was a person whose past was wounded by sorrow and resentment. She shared her tragic story, recounting the loss of loved ones, and how circumstances had forced her onto a slippery path of crime. She confessed she was unjustly accused of a bank robbery she never committed. Jacob listened without interruption, absorbing every word, every tremor in her voice. He saw in her confession not just bare facts, but a tormented soul seeking understanding. He realized that behind her crimes lay something more than a simple greed. In her eyes, darkened by grief and despair, he saw not a villainess, but a broken person desperately in need of saving. His heart filled not only with physical attraction, but also with deep affection, an overwhelming desire to protect her from the entire world. That night, they crept away from the house, abandoning everything they held dear. Under the cloak of darkness, illuminated only by the pale light of the moon, they moved south, toward the Mexican border, hoping to find some semblance of sanctuary. Jacob knew they were being hunted. He sensed that soon everyone would know about them, the sheriffs, the merciless bounty hunters, the greedy bandits, willing to do anything for a reward. There wasn't much time left to find a way out of this deadly trap. They had endured many trials, cold nights, agonizing hunger, unbearable thirst, and encounters with hostile people. But, despite it all, they survived, because they always stuck together. Jacob, gradually shedding his distrust, learned to rely on Elizabeth, and she, in turn, opened up to him, revealing her best qualities, baring her soul. One day, after many wanderings, they reached a quiet town, a place that was drowning in greenery. It sprawled in a picturesque valley, surrounded on all sides by high, majestic mountains. Jacob, captivated by the serenity of the place, suggested to Elizabeth that they stay, weathering the difficult times and resting from the hardships of their long journey. They found shelter on a long-abandoned ranch, situated on the very edge of the town. Jacob found work on a farm, and Elizabeth helped him with the household chores. They lived together as if husband and wife, though their marriage was never officially registered. But it didn't matter. For they were happy. But their peace was short-lived. One day, a new sheriff arrived in town. A young, energetic man, with determination etched on every line of his face, he immediately began investigating old, long-forgotten cases. Very soon, Elizabeth caught his attention. The sheriff arrived at their doorstep while Jacob was toiling in the field. Elizabeth, as pale as chalk, stood petrified, frozen in place before him. "You are under arrest for the robbery of the bank," the sheriff announced, his voice harsh and emotionless. Elizabeth uttered not a word, nor did she make a single move to resist. She clearly understood that her time was up. Jacob returned home only when Elizabeth was already being taken away to prison, placed within the cage of an old wagon. He was consumed by fury. He couldn't allow her to be imprisoned. The decision solidified instantly: he would help her escape. He knew perfectly well the danger that awaited him, that the penalty for this crime was a death sentence. He was prepared to do anything to save his beloved Elizabeth. Night cloaked the city with a thick blanket as he, striving to remain in the shadows, snuck into the grim prison walls. His heart hammered with desperation. Every rustle, every creak, seemed a harbinger of doom. Yet, he managed to free Elizabeth. Together, they fled the city, hoping to escape their pursuers. Their path led south, towards the border with Mexico. After traveling hundreds of miles, exhausted but filled with hope, they reached the coveted line. They were so close, just a few steps away from freedom. But at the very border, an ambush awaited them. The sheriff and his men, like predatory wolves, lay in wait. At that moment, when hope of rescue seemed so close, a shootout erupted. Bullets whizzed through the air, and Jacob, like a raging beast, fought desperately to protect Elizabeth. He took several men down, but the odds were clearly against them. One of the bullets found its mark, piercing his flesh. Blood soaked his clothes. Elizabeth, with a desperate cry, rushed to him, trying to help, to bandage the wound, but her own strength was fading. She felt weakness overcoming her, knowing they wouldn't survive. In the desperate glow of the sunset, she looked into Jacob's eyes, and bitter tears shone in her own. "Forgive me," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the roar of gunfire. He smiled at her, trying to encourage her. "You are not at fault," he said, striving to keep his voice steady. At that very moment, as they prepared for their final battle, a deafening gunshot shattered the air. The sheriff collapsed, slain instantly. Jacob and Elizabeth were paralyzed with horror, unable to believe their eyes. Beside them, seemingly appearing from nowhere, stood the old Native American, Jacob's loyal friend, ready to help. His wrinkled face expressed determination, and his eyes seemed to see not only the present but also the future. Thanks to his assistance, they managed to escape the deadly trap. They fled into the mountains, escaping pursuit, and found refuge there. There, far from human eyes, they lived a long and happy life, starting anew. Elizabeth was exonerated, and her name was finally cleared of all charges. Jacob and Elizabeth had found each other, discovering freedom and long-awaited peace. Sometimes, as they sat by the crackling fire, Jacob would drift into memories. He remembered his solitary life on the farm, troubled by thoughts of the past, of the mistake he had made, and, of course, his tender love for Elizabeth. Then, he realized clearly that it had all been worthwhile. He had found his path, and fate had led him to her. They had found each other, and that was perhaps the most important thing. Now, gazing at the boundless starry sky, he felt how life had gained its true meaning. They were together, and this was forever.